webinar is sea salt, and over the course of the last, I want to say 3 or 4 years, as paleo is becoming almost a household word, there are literally hundreds of books that are springing up on the notion of paleo and what paleo actually is. And so I've been privy to some of these books and have been able to read the recipes that are being produced. And a common element in many of the recipes is sea salt. And so that's really what this webinar and this talk is all about, is to kind of look at sea salt, see what it is, where it comes from, what elements are in it, and is it any better than table salt, and what are some of the health effects that we need to be concerned with when we consume sea salt. So let's just move right into the very first slide, if everyone is happy and can hear the audio and can see the video. Okay, so to me, kind of as an academic, a very simplistic question is, what in the world is sea salt? And so it turns out that sea salt is nothing more than evaporated seawater. And there's a couple of ways in which we can manufacture sea salt. It can be mined from the earth where there were pre-existing seabeds, and it gets mixed up with quite a few impurities. Or typically it can be manufactured by solar evaporation. And if you look at the slide, you can kind of see how they locate these solar evaporation beds next to the ocean, pump water, seawater into it, and then let the sun and the wind evaporate it. So that's pretty much what sea salt is. If you look at sea salt, we've all probably been in the ocean, you've tasted seawater, and you know that it tastes pretty salty, and so we call that salinity. And if you take 1,000 grams of seawater, it turns out that there are roughly 35 grams of various dissolved salts in that seawater. And you can see in this little pie chart, I've kind of identified that. And so for every 1,000 grams of water, the 35 grams of dissolved salts, we refer to that as 35 parts per thousand. And then we can break down that little white triangle in my pie chart into the dissolved salts. And you'll notice that the predominant salt in seawater is chloride, and the next is sodium. So sodium chloride, NaCl, is what we refer to as salt. So the majority of the salt in the dissolved salts is sodium chloride. And you can see the next most concentrated salt is a salt called sulfate, followed by magnesium, calcium, potassium, and there are other salts that we'll look at on the very next slide. So the point that I want to make is that the salinity of seawater can vary depending upon the ocean that we are extracting the sea salt from. So if you are very close to the outlet of the Amazon River, where there's a lot of fresh water coming in, the salinity is lowered, but surprisingly, the percentages of all the salts in the dissolved seawater remains constant. So you can see over here this little colorful pie chart, those relations of all those salts, the chloride, the sodium, the sulfates, they remain constant no matter what the salinity is. And that's really the crucial part when we look at what salt, sea salt actually is. And so here's a table of sea salt. And so once we knock all the water out, we evaporate all the water, the remaining salts are chloride, sodium, and they comprise 85.62% of the salt in sea salt that we consume commercially. And you can see sulfate, and magnesium, and calcium on down the line. And there's bromide and borate and strontium and fluoride and all kinds of other elements. But I can tell you right now that from a nutritional perspective, most of this really doesn't matter. And the big issue is the high salt content of seawater. So let's take a look at the very next slide here. And let's contrast sea salt to table salt. And so what in the world is table salt? Table salt is almost always made from refined or from sea salt or rock salt, and frequently from lake salt. And what they do in the manufacture of table salt is they try to remove all of these other salts, leaving basically pure sodium chloride. And so there's a process, an industrial process called vacuum pan refining, and that process then typically gives us sodium chloride that is virtually pure, between 99.8 to 99.95% pure sodium chloride. Under U.S. law, manufacturers can include a number of additives, and they need to put in anti-caking devices, because if they didn't, the salt all clumps together and it wouldn't pour. Typically in the U.S., the calcium silicate is added to table salt. It doesn't seem to have much physiologic or nutritional effects. In many times, you have the option as a consumer when you go to the store, you can buy refined salt that either has iodine added to it or salt without iodine. Iodine is added to salt to prevent goiter. It's a disease of the thyroid gland. And you can't, the additive is potassium iodide that is included at the concentrations you can see on the screen. They have to put stabilizers with the potassium iodide to prevent it from degrading. And the most common one is dextrose. So dextrose is glucose. You're actually getting a little bit, tiny amount of sugar when you pour salt on your food that has potassium iodide in it. Sometimes it has sodium bicarbonate. Are we all doing okay with the audio and the visual? Seems like we are. Okay, so the next question that comes up relates to what is the effect of salt in our body? And before I can answer that question, what I really need to do is to talk to you about how much salt we actually eat. And if you look at the amount of salt that's in the typical U.S. diet in terms of grams per day, it's almost 10 grams. And listed here in this table, you can see that virtually all of it comes from processed foods, a little bit from salt that we shake on our food at the table, and some salt that we put into cooking. Naturally occurring foods, real foods, like paleo foods, living foods, they have very little salt in it. So you can see the contribution of real foods to the salt in our diet is actually minimal. And so a point I want to make here before we actually move on to the physiologic and health effects of salt is to look at if we were to somehow magically replace all of the table salt, all the added salt in our diet with sea salt, would it really make a difference? And so notice that there are 8.6 grams of table salt or salt added to our diet. Let me just go back to the previous slide so you can see where that 8.6 comes from. You'll notice that the salt in added processed foods is 7.2 grams, and what we throw into our cooking and our discretionary salt at the table is 1.4. So that's where the 8.6 comes from. If we were to take that 8.6 grams of salt and magically replace it with sea salt, would it matter? Would it make a difference? It actually would slightly reduce the sodium chloride intake, because the sodium chloride intake, or the sodium chloride content in table salt is higher than it is in sea salt. The magnesium intake actually looks like it would increase fairly substantially if we were to consume sea salt. And so notice then it would increase by 316 milligrams. The daily recommended intake for magnesium is 400 milligrams. So this on paper at least looks like it'd be a really good thing. Calcium intake would increase by about 100 milligrams, and this would slightly add to the recommended intake, but I'll show you here in a minute that it actually physiologically worsens what happens to calcium metabolism in our body. Potassium intake would increase by 95 milligrams, but actually this much sodium in the diet would worsen the potassium intake physiologically. So at least on paper, it looks like it might be a better choice to do sea salt. But in actuality, in the human body and with animal experiments, it turns out that sea salt is even worse than refined salt. And so, but if you look at the sodium chloride concentration in sea salt, it's 85.6% salt or sodium chloride. And if you look at it in table salt, it's 99.9% salt. So there is very little difference, and the bottom line is both of these high sodium chloride concentrations are not good and they're undesirable. And way back in the early 60s, animal studies, they fed mice a diet in which the salt came from either sea salt or from table salt. And you can see those two citations by Dahl and his group. It turns out that blood pressure or high blood pressure was worsened by the consumption of sea salt, and they had suggested in these studies that it resulted because of the other dissolved salts that somehow had an additive effect on the sodium chloride. So the available animal and human evidence tells us that neither one of these additives to our diet is a good thing. So let's take a look once again at the salt sources of diet in the U.S. food supply. Most of us don't eat sea salt, but it probably wouldn't really matter in terms of the sodium chloride intake. And notice that the huge portion of the pie for salt intake comes from processed food. 77% of the salt in our diet comes from processed foods. Well, that doesn't, for paleo dieters, one of the very first things that I encourage you people to do is to get processed packaged foods out of your diet. And if you do, one of the instant beneficial effects is to lower the salt, the sodium chloride from all sources. I also, in all of my books, have encouraged you not to use salt in cooking and to get rid of your salt shaker on the table so that you don't salt food. And hopefully you'll get all of your salt from naturally occurring foods. And if you do that, it actually increases the potassium intake. And so there's a very good reciprocal relationship between sodium and potassium. And when you eat real living foods, you get a ton of potassium. Fruits and vegetables and nuts are all loaded up with potassium. And you reduce the added salt, we're going to get the sodium to potassium ratios where we find them in hunter-gatherer societies. So let's look at the top 10 sources of salt in the U.S. diet. This came from the Centers for Disease Control. February of 2012 is when they published this. And surprisingly for many people, it turns out that bread and rolls are actually the #1 source of salt in the U.S. diet. So I don't know of too many paleo dieters that regularly consume wheat or bread or cereal grains. That doesn't seem to be a contentious issue. If you do it occasionally, I don't see it as a huge problem. That's why we have the 85-15 rule. But if you cut these things out for the most part from your diet, then you're getting the #1 source of salt out of your diet. The next source of salt in the U.S. diet are cold cuts and cured meats. In all of my books, I encourage you not to consume meats like what you see in the upper right-hand corner of the diagram, or the meats that you see in the sandwich in the middle, or the meats that you see, the pepperoni and the pizza. So, and obviously #3, pizza is not part of paleo, and so I understand that some people are attempting to make non-paleo pizza with almond flours and so forth, but once again, if you add salt of any sort and processed meat and cheeses to the pizza, then you're basically getting the same salt load. Poultry, I don't have a problem with it, particularly if you eat fresh poultry. The only poultry, Colonel Sanders, is problematic because of the powder and the things that they put on it. But if you eat real free-ranging chicken and geese and other poultry, it's perfectly acceptable. Soups, you can easily make soups that don't have salt or sodium in them. I don't know that there's a whole lot of commercial brands that do this, but it's much better to make your own from scratch, and in all of my books we have recipes how to make paleo soups. Sandwiches are not paleo, but you can certainly make wraps with lettuce on the outside. Romaine is a great way to put meat together into a sandwich setting. Just make sure you don't put a ton of mustard and pickles and other high salt foods, including cheeses, on it. There's been I know a lot of interest in the notion of whether or not dairy is paleo. Well, clearly people couldn't have consumed dairy products until they domesticated animals, and that only happened after the advent of agriculture. So no hunter-gatherers consume dairy in any form, be it cheese or milk or yogurt or any of that. Having said that, once again, we have the 85-15 rule, and if you absolutely love to have a piece of Gruyere or Swiss cheese with a glass of wine, before you start your weekend, do so. Behaviorally, it's going to help you stay on the diet, then let's do that. It's not what you do occasionally that's going to hurt you health-wise, it's what you do every single day. So every single day, cheese should not be part of it. Now down here in the left-hand corner, you can see bacon. I know that bacon is a big favorite with paleo dieters. You can get bacon that is not cured with nitrites and nitrates, and you can actually get bacon that doesn't have salt in it. And so that's fine if you can find a distributor or manufacturer of bacon that is paleo. We've already talked about cheeses. Pasta dishes are simply not paleo. All meat dishes except for processed meats can be paleo, particularly if you cook them in a manner in which you don't add salt. Most snacks, chips and so forth, are not paleo, but there are very many options for healthy snacks that I've talked about in all of my books. Okay, so here's some others too that I think people are somewhat mouth-watering and they hate to give up, but salted nuts, well, you can eat nuts. They're clearly paleo. Just try to stay away from the salted ones. There's all kinds of versions of nuts without salt. We talked about bacon. Down here in the lower left corner is a can of sardines, and you can certainly get canned fish that is in a water pack without salt. That's much healthier, and healthier still is fresh fish. The manufacturing industry still hasn't got up to par and recognized that paleo is going to be with us for a long time, and so we need to get non-salt versions of salsa. I think you can get non-salt versions of tomato sauce. I know you can get non-salt versions of tuna. So it is possible to do this. We also have a smoked salmon, which is one of my favorites. And so it's possible to produce these foods without salt, and we just need to get the manufacturers up to speed with this. Here's some other ones. Anchovies are way salty. The other issues here, like Tabasco sauce, it's certainly possible to make a hot sauce, a Tabasco sauce, without salt, but I haven't seen one on the market. Similarly with mayonnaise. Ketchup can be made without salt or refined sugars, and we actually have recipes on how to make some of these condiments, mayonnaise and tomato sauce, in my books, and hopefully we'll get some bright manufacturers who want to get these foods out for people that are interested. Similarly, it's an unusual commercial salad dressing that is not made without salt, and once again, I have numerous recipes in my books on how to make very delicious salad dressings that don't have salt or refined sugar in them. So, to kind of summarize, if you compare the sodium content of real living foods, which are paleo foods, and you look down here, you can see fruits, meats, fish, and veggies, and contrast that to all processed foods. You can see processed foods contain anywhere from 2 to 3 times more sodium than do real living foods. And that also brings up a good issue. Is it the sodium in salt that causes the problem, or is it the chloride, or is it both? Well, if you look at most healthcare folks and physicians, we talk about sodium so much, we don't realize that the chloride anion also is responsible for hypertension, the hypertensive effects of sodium. And this has been very well documented in the scientific literature. I've given you a citation down here from 1991. I believe by 91 there was more than 30 references showing that if you fed hypertensives sodium citrate or sodium bicarbonate, it didn't elevate blood pressure, whereas sodium chloride did. So bottom line is the chloride ion is just as responsible as is the sodium ion in elevating blood pressure. And you can see then, if you look at sodium chloride and we calculate the molecular weight of each and divide it, the ratio is 1.54, meaning that you have about half as much or half more chloride than you do sodium. So chloride tends to not only elevate blood pressure, but yields a net acid load to the kidney, and that tends to cause a slight metabolic acidosis, which in of itself has numerous problems. All right, so paleo dieters and anybody else who thinks that by replacing table salt with sea salt, they're going to have physiologic and health benefits are absolutely wrong. And so it's the total amount of sodium chloride in your diet, and you can dose yourself with sea salt and get your sodium chloride values every bit as high as you can with table salt. So I recommend not doing either one. And everybody here recognizes that blood pressure is influenced by high salt diets. Not everybody is salt sensitive. Only a certain percentage of the population are salt sensitive in terms of their blood pressure. Nevertheless, there are other effects of salt that we now know over the long term are not good for us, even if we don't have high blood pressure. It predisposes you to stroke if you live long enough. It predisposes both men and women to osteoporosis, kidney stones, and stomach cancer. Some of the more obscure diseases that are not as well documented in the medical literature are Meniere's syndrome, or ringing of the ears, insomnia. I saw something on the news the other night that, I don't know, a third or more of the entire American adult population doesn't sleep well. A certain percentage takes sleeping pills and medication to try to get to sleep. I would suggest one of the best things you can do is to try to get the salt out of your diet and see how that helps you. Motion sickness seems to have an element that is involved with salt, because the inner ear is involved with motion sickness, and high salt diet seems to impact the way the inner ear functions. Work from our laboratory has shown that salt adversely affects exercise-induced asthma. We did that work more than a decade ago. Animal and human models. It seems to be therapeutic for asthma patients if they get the salt out of their diet as well. Okay, less well appreciated is that high salt diets seem to promote a variety of cancers. My colleague, Birger Jansen, who has now passed away at the Cancer Center in Texas, he was one of the first to blow the whistle on the notion that high salt diets tend to promote cancers, and the mechanisms for these were outlined by Loren Cordain and his group. And high salt diets, even in healthy individuals using magnetic resonance imaging techniques, show that high salt diets increase the intracellular concentrations of sodium, reduce intracellular potassium, increase intracellular calcium, reduce magnesium, and change intracellular pH. These are all intracellular ionic changes that occur in cancer. So it hasn't been, and it's been shown in animal models that high salt diets tend to promote cancer as well. In humans, cancer takes a lifetime to develop, but once again, there's many therapeutic effects. The most recent of which, and I didn't get a chance to prepare a slide on this, is salt in autoimmune disease, because it is so recent. It's only been within the last 3 to 6 months. There's a series of papers that has come out showing how high salt diets then exacerbate autoimmune disease. And what they do is they tend to upregulate part of the immune system, which is called a T helper cell 17, or Th17. And so upregulation of Th17 is associated with virtually all autoimmune disease. We don't have any human trials because this concept is so new. Another benefit to get the salt out of your diet, whether it's sea salt or table salt. So let's take a look at the hunter-gatherer perspective. Whenever we have a dietary or nutrition question, I think it doesn't hurt to take a look at the way evolution through natural selection designed our bodies to operate. And it turns out that the archaeologic evidence shows that salt was rarely used by inland hunter-gatherers. So in areas where they could obtain it, on dry lake beds or in certain deposits where it occurs above ground, they showed no interest in it. And the first archaeologic evidence we have is in China about 8,000 years ago from a dry lake bed. And if you see this photograph here on the upper left. This is a mountain of salt in Catalonia, Spain, and it wasn't excavated until about 6,000 years ago. So people in Europe seem not to be interested in these salt deposits, at least the inland folks. There's probably no doubt that hunter-gatherers living near the ocean exploited salt water and seawater. We just don't have any good data on how that was done or how much they consumed. Inland hunter-gatherers rarely, if ever, used salt. There are some incidences of inland hunter-gatherers trying to extract salts from the residue of fires and burnt wood and so forth. So some evidence for it, but nothing like 10 grams of salt a day. So, the paleo diet. Here's what the paleo diet's all about, and I'm preaching to the choir, I realized, for the members on this group. Fresh veggies as much as you want, fresh fruits. Let's get grass-produced meats. Don't worry about whether they're lean or not. I think any grass-produced meats and fresh fish and seafood are right on target. Even salty fresh seafood like crab and lobster and some other foods, go for it. The health benefits way outweigh the small amounts of naturally occurring salt that come from those foods. Healthful oils, olive oils, coconut oil. We've listed all of these in my most recent books. You can get them on my website. Nuts and seeds are pretty much okay. There can be some immune issues here, and they also can unbalance the fatty acid profile of your diet if you eat too many nuts, because they're very, very low, they're very high in linoleic acid, which tends to be pro-inflammatory. All right, so let me go back here. We wrote a paper back in 2002 in which we actually examined the nutritional characteristics of perhaps 200 or 300 diets that were comprised of these elements. I had a doctoral student that helped me with this data collection, and so we did computerized dietary analysis on all of these diets. And typically, here's what we found. This would be a typical diet, and somebody eats half a cantaloupe for breakfast, a little bit of broiled Atlantic salmon for lunch, maybe a broiled pork chop, a huge salad comprised of all those elements there, virtually anything you want to put in. You're better off doing olive oil and lemon juice rather than a commercial oil, and you can certainly get that at most restaurants if you have to eat out. Dinner, we see, is, it doesn't have to be lean beef. It can be any kind of beef, sirloin tip, particularly any grass-produced beef, steamed broccoli, another big salad, dessert, strawberries as much as you want, and you can snack throughout the day. So if we take these elements and break them down nutritionally, what does it turn out it looks like? Well, you see the middle column here is the paleo diet, and what I've done here is contrast the paleo diet to the food pyramid, and then I've contrasted both of those to what we actually get in the typical U.S. diet. A couple of key factors come out, and most of you know this already. Paleo diet is very high in protein. It's considerably lower in carbohydrate, particularly refined carbohydrates, because we don't eat refined carbohydrates on this type of a diet. Even though we eat lots of fruits and lots of vegetables, the total sugars are considerably lower than what we have in either the food pyramid, which is now called the food plate, or the actual U.S. diet. Fat is considerably higher, but I don't consider this an issue anymore, and I haven't for close to a decade. I think it's not a matter of how much fat, it's more a matter of the types of fat. And notice that the types of fat in a paleo diet are very helpful, the way the mix is set up. We have high amounts of monounsaturates, high amounts of omega-3, low amounts of omega-6. And then in regards to this lecture, you can see that the sodium content is way, way low. But even more impressive is look at how high the potassium intake is. And so we think that a high potassium intake can overcome even higher sodium intake. So if you want to have that slice of cheese, or if you want to eat a French fry occasionally, don't worry about it, because if you're eating lots of fresh fruits and veggies, it'll tend to wash out any salt that you get when you go off the diet for a little bit. So we're getting to the end here, and to me, this is really what it's all about. And I have trouble. I can't understand why nutritionists say that this is a dangerous diet. It's actually incredibly nutritionally dense, way more so than the USDA food plate, the Mediterranean diet, or even Japanese type diets. And so when you look at these slides, I think it really drives it home, is you notice that grass-produced meats like what you see here are way more nutritionally dense, have much superior effect to our blood lipids than do whole grain breads. Fresh fruits are much, much better to eat than processed meats or cheeses. Veggies are way better than cheeses or any conglomeration that we can make with cheeses or breads. And here's the second to the last slide, and then we'll open it up for questions. Look at that broiled salmon. Boy, that just looks delicious for me. Whereas that stuff doesn't look very good anymore. And if you look at how much salt is in it, remember the #1 salt source in the U.S. diet comes from bread. So hamburgers, you got a lot of salt in the bread, you got a lot of salt in the cheese, you got a lot of salt in the French fries, and hamburger was probably cooked with salt added to it. It is possible to get cheeses that have low salt content, but most are very high sources of salt. Cottage cheese is a low source of salt. And then finally, this is the time of the year I absolutely love berries. You can get them fairly inexpensively. I would much rather go and watch a ballpark game and eat fresh berries than a hot dog and chips. Finally, don't worry about eggs, particularly if you can get free-ranging eggs. This is a good time of the year with the farmer's market to go and get yourself a ton of eggs. Don't worry about the cholesterol or the saturated fats. These are actually good for your profile. If you can get bacon that is unsalted and doesn't have nitrate in it, don't worry about it. And then to me, a great lunch would be this shrimp and avocado salad versus a sandwich. So thank you very much, and I think we'll open it up for question and answer.
So Kenneth Shepard asks, if we consume raw milk from purely grass-fed cows into the paleo plan, is that in any way, shape, or form paleo? How is the salt intake with raw dairy products?
Well, the salt intake isn't problematic with raw dairy products, so you don't have to worry about salt. But whether raw or pasteurized or whatever, milk has an adverse effect on our blood insulin levels. And so we have preliminary evidence in children showing that Julian, my screen just crashed on me. Okay. Your health and well-being, which you do 15% of the time, probably doesn't hurt you. If you can tolerate a little bit of raw milk occasionally, go ahead and do it. But I don't think it's a good thing to do on a longer basis. I think you're much better off getting your calcium from fresh vegetables, leafy greens, broccoli, and so forth.
Loren, it looks like people did not hear why you can or cannot consume raw dairy products. If you wouldn't mind repeating your answer, that would be great.
Well, I didn't say that you couldn't consume it, and that's always been my point, is that the paleo diet, we have what we call the 85-15 rule, and you can, if you would like, you can eat certain foods up to 15% of your weekly calories. So if you occasionally want to have a glass of raw milk, go for it. But I think there are better food choices, and I wouldn't encourage people to eat raw dairy products or consume them on a regular basis. And the reason for it is that dairy products have a very high insulin index, and there is evidence in children showing that they produce insulin resistance. So drinking milk, whether it's raw or pasteurized on a regular basis, tends to promote insulin resistance. I've outlined that in my latest book, The Paleo Answer. I have an entire chapter with all the scientific references showing why you probably shouldn't do that. But like I said earlier, if you want to have a slice of cheese and a glass of wine on Friday night, go for it. It's not what you do occasionally that's going to hurt you. It's what you do every single day.
Diane Menendez asks, I'm 50 and my blood pressure has always been about 100/60, except while I was pregnant. Why should I worry about my salt intake if hypertension doesn't run in my family?
Well, recall that when we talked about the health problems with high salt diet, it's not just blood pressure. So I think that osteoporosis is a problem for most women as they approach menopause and beyond. And so if your DEXA scans look healthy, then, and you're not having any issues with hypertension, and you don't have any autoimmune diseases, then I would say play it by ear. Always listen to your body. Your body is more knowledgeable than me or any other person from an ivory tower. So the paleo diet is a starting point, and if you can follow it with a little bit of salt, don't worry about it.
Great. Doug asks, sometimes I purchase tortilla sprouted products and make roll of turkey slices with lettuce, mustard, and relish. Do you feel that sprouted bread products are as bad as processed flour products?
Well, it depends specifically on which ones you're looking at. I know that you can get sprouted grains from wheat, and I would suggest that that's not a good idea to eat those. And then putting condiments, high salted condiments, food into your rolls there are better ways of doing it. And I think really what we need to do is we need to kind of wean ourselves off of these high salted foods like mustards and relishes and so forth. And if you do this and you get off of a high salt diet for a couple of 3-4 weeks and you go back to foods that you thought were tasty before, you find that they're actually too salty.
Kenneth is under the impression that there are a number of health benefits of Himalayan salts. How do you trump all the sources that say slight Himalayan salt intake is okay?
I would dispute those sources. The sodium chloride content of Himalayan salt is similar to both sea salt and table salt. And so it's a bad idea to eat a high salt diet in any way, shape, or form. Himalayan salts are incredibly expensive. I believe they sell for, I don't know, $9 a pound versus 40 cents a pound for table salt. So you're paying a lot of money for really no therapeutic effects that have ever been demonstrated in the scientific literature.
Great, thanks, Loren. Do we have any more questions? James Gordon is wondering, how does alfalfa sprouts, how do they play into the paleo diet?
Excuse me. Alfalfa sprouts are really not a good idea to eat on a regular basis for a couple of reasons. They contain, they have high concentrations of a compound called saponins. Some of the highest compounds of saponins in any food that we eat in our diet. And saponins, as the word sounds, are soaps. And what they do is they tend to disrupt biological membranes. So when you eat high concentrations of any saponin-containing food like legumes or alfalfa sprouts, it tends to increase intestinal permeability. Alfalfa sprouts are also unusual in that they contain a high concentration of another anti-nutrient that causes autoimmune disease in an animal model. And in my latest book, The Paleo Answer, I outline that evidence and I outline what that compound is. So I think that alfalfa sprouts are food that really you should stay away from a paleo perspective. If you happen to eat them once in a blue moon, no big issue, but it's just not a good idea. And there is at least 1 or 2 human studies where they've induced this autoimmune disease by consuming alfalfa sprouts. And off the top of my head, I don't remember the exact references, but they are in my 5th book, and you can pull those out. Or if you email me with that question, I can look that information up for you.
Loren Cordain is asking, how do you feel about green powdered grasses?
Yeah, this is an item that has been in health food stores for years, where you can actually go in and they'll juice wheatgrass for you, and then you can even still get it in powdered form. One of the problems is that plants just don't make their structures and their seeds and their roots and everything for the consumption, the ad-libitum consumption of humans or other animals. Their plant parts are made to photosynthesize, make food for themselves, make seeds for reproduction. And so one of the evolutionary strategies plants have done is to prevent predation by birds and insects and all kinds of other animals, is they provision themselves with what are called anti-nutrients or secondary compounds. And grass blades or grass seeds are concentrated sources of anti-nutrients, particularly cereal and wheat and what have you. So I think that you're better off by replacing those exotic foods, thinking you're going to get something that you wouldn't get with fresh fruits and veggies and meats and so forth, particularly traditional fruits and vegetables that humans have consumed forever.
Great. Lori is asking, what is the difference in eating raw versus cooked food, and can you eat too much cooked food? Does the salt intake differentiate between raw and cooked?
Well, you know, there was a time when all humans ate only raw foods because they hadn't the ability to start fire whenever they wanted to. So at the very earliest stages of humanity, people had to rely upon gathering fire from lightning strikes and volcanic eruptions and so forth, which is a very hit and miss deal. So here in Colorado, even though we have a lot of lightning, I could drive around in a car even after storms, and it would be difficult for me to find a lightning strike. So with our hunter-gatherer ancestors, if they were 12 or 15 or 20 miles away from a lightning strike, probably couldn't get any fire. So until we had invented what are called fire sticks and other technology where we could start fires at will, we were stuck with raw foods. Does that mean that we should be eating raw foods as modern-day paleo dieters? No, I don't think so. And I've outlined those issues in my 1st book, and I think my 5th book. And there are some nutrients that we increase the absorption by cooking. So steaming some vegetables like carrots, you actually increase the beta-carotene intake. There are certain risks involved in eating raw meats, not the least of which are pathogens like E. coli. You've all heard about people eating hamburger that's been contaminated with E. coli, and it can be fatal, particularly in the elderly and young children, if you don't get to it rapidly. So I think that it makes more sense to cook your meats slowly and lightly, because high cooking of meat tends to produce at least 3 types of compounds that in animals have been shown to be carcinogenic. So I've outlined all of these issues. I think we've actually had a blog or 2 on the compounds that are found in meat that's been cooked at high temperatures, as well as processed meats. So the trick with cooking meat or fish is steaming it or slow cooking it, and don't burn the heck out of it. If you happen to go to a barbecue where somebody does blacken a steak and it's raw on the inside, you don't have to say anything. Just take your steak knife and cut the blackened part away and eat the inner part, and you're in good shape.
Okay, let's take one final question. Andrew asks that a lot of traditional cultures like the Maasai and the Inuit have a lot of high salt intake, and yet their health is pristine. How would you comment on that?
Well, first off, I would challenge the notion that both the Maasai and the Inuit have a high salt intake. The Maasai, one of their dietary staples is blood, so they actually do venipunctures of their domestic cow, and they drink blood. Blood, like muscle tissue, blood has roughly the same concentration of sodium chloride that you see in other tissues, so it's not concentrated. The Maasai, as far as I know, at least before Westernization, or before they had access to Western goods, they were not consuming salt, and where they're located as a group, there are some dry lake beds where they could potentially obtain it, and they could certainly obtain it through trade with other African groups. But I don't know of any dietary study of the Maasai that have shown that they have a high salt intake. In terms of the Inuit, they're in a similar boat. Before Westernization, they would have rarely had access, unless they were living in coastal areas, they would have rarely had access to salt, because in the terrestrial environment, salt is a very rare compound. The normal ratio in terrestrial environments, potassium is the dominant salt.